Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Alex Galazzini, and I'm one of the program managers at the Chicago Council on Science and Technology. Welcome to today's program, Chicago's Animal Kingdom. This program is presented to you by C2ST in partnership with the Urban Wildlife Institute at Lincoln Park Zoo and the Chicago Rat Project. If you're new to C2ST, we're a not-for-profit organization founded in 2007 that is working to enhance the public's understanding and appreciation of science and technology and their impact on society. Please visit c2st.org to learn how you can donate and find information about our upcoming programs. You can also sign up for our mailing list so that you get reminders about these programs. To ask questions of our experts during the program, please type c2st.cnf.io into your browser and click today's session. This is also where you can evaluate the session afterwards. Our staff will be checking C2ST TV on YouTube and our Facebook Live for your questions as well. Again, to ask questions directly, go to c2st.cnf.io. Today, we will be highlighting the work done by the Urban Wildlife Institute at Lincoln Park Zoo, including some of the ways to participate in citizen science and the specific work of the Chicago Rat Project. Now, I'd like to introduce the two speakers here to highlight Chicago's Animal Kingdom, Dr. Seth Magle and Dr. Maureen Murray. Seth Magle is the director of the Urban Wildlife Institute and the executive director of the Urban Wildlife Information Network. Seth has published over 40 articles on urban wildlife ecology, and his vision is to help create a world in which urban ecosystems are an important component of worldwide biodiversity conservation. Maureen Murray is a wildlife disease ecologist at the Urban Wildlife Institute, whose areas of expertise include wildlife disease, urban wildlife ecology, and animal behavior. Through her work, Maureen hopes to prevent disease transmission between animals and humans and promote coexistence within urban ecosystems. Seth, I'm going to turn this presentation over to you. We all look forward to learning from you.
Oh, I'm muted. Oh, I'm unmuted. Thanks so much. I hope you all enjoy this presentation. Maureen and I are going to pass it back and forth just a little bit. But I'm going to start by giving you a little bit of an overview into the work that we do at the Urban Wildlife Institute, and more importantly, why we do that work, essentially why it matters. So if you could share my slides now, that would be great. I will pause a moment, but hopefully you're all seeing this raccoon slide. So Maureen and I work at a zoo. We work at the Lincoln Park Zoo. And if you imagine someone who works at a zoo studying animals, I would guess you're probably imagining someone who goes out somewhere far away from us, somewhere like Africa or South America, and they go deep into sort of untraveled habitats, and they look for these rare exotic animals like red pandas or lions, right? And so all the very exciting exotic Animal Planet stuff. And zoos do this, and our zoo does this. We have people who work in Tanzania and the Congo and all kinds of places. So this is sort of the traditional view of a zoo biologist, is like someone who's like fighting poachers and doing all that exciting stuff. But Maureen and I don't fit that mold exactly. We're weird. We are weird zoo biologists because our study area is not so far away. A lot of you are probably sitting in our study area right now. And the animals that we study, for the most part, are not rare. They are very common. They are things you all know. They are things like foxes and squirrels and raccoons and pigeons. So whenever I give a talk like this, I always first come prepared to answer the question of, what are you doing? Like, why are you doing that? It's a weird thing to spend time and money on. Why does anybody care about these urban animals that sort of live all over? And there's really, I think, three main reasons. The first is, I want to first make the point briefly that wildlife live in cities all around the world. You have different species, but every city around the world has these urban wildlife species. So, like I said, bringing into why does that matter? Why do we want to study them? I think we're a zoo. So the first reason has to do with connecting people with nature. We know that everybody lives in some kind of form of nature. Anywhere you live, there are birds, there are mammals, there are things living all around you. And they're just as valid, they're just as ecologically interesting as animals that live anywhere. And we know that when it comes to connecting people with nature, it works best to start where they are, to start where there's something that they might care about. It's kind of hard to get someone to care about the endangered white rhino living halfway around the world that they might never see if they don't even know about the animals that live in their backyard. So when we think about connecting people in nature, we want to start where those people are. Another really critical reason has to do with conservation. Traditionally, the way we've tried to conserve wildlife is we said, okay, cities are the problem. Cities are spreading out. They're taking up all this habitat. So what we'll do is we'll create nature areas and protected areas outside of the city. That's where the animals will live. We'll live in the city. That has worked okay, but the cities are still spreading out. We're continuing to increase the human population. Cities are getting bigger and bigger. And at some point, that model is going to break down. We're not going to be able to conserve all of the animals that we need to conserve on an urbanizing planet unless we think harder about how do we make progress in the city? How do we actually make sure that cities are not just a black hole for wildlife, that cities are a place for people, sure, but also for animals, and a place where people and wildlife can live, can coexist side by side. But to do that, you have to get at the third reason that we study urban wildlife, and that has to do with conflict. Animals live in cities, people live in cities, and sometimes those animals do things we'd rather they didn't. You can imagine all different kinds of animal conflict, everything from animals that dig up your garden or dig under your deck to animals that we hit with our cars, animals that transmit diseases to us, or even in rare instances, animals who attack our pets or attack us. Maybe some of you remember last year, just before the pandemic, actually, a coyote attacked a child right outside the Notabert Nature Museum in Chicago pretty seriously. It doesn't happen often, but it does happen. And if we understood these urban animals better, we could reduce these conflicts. And that is sort of the perfect intro to Maureen is going to talk to you all. Dr. Maureen Murray is going to talk to you about probably the most glamorous urban wildlife species you can possibly imagine, which is rats. Not a lot of people study rats. I think most people just sort of consider them icky and just it stops there. So you'd be surprised how little we know about rats and how we can limit our conflicts between humans and rats. So that is what Dr. Maureen Murray is going to talk about now. So I think we will throw it over to her.
Thanks, Seth, for that introduction. Yeah, if you could throw up my slides, that would be great. I'm glad you used the word glamorous, Seth, because that's also the word that I would use to describe a pretty large contingent of Chicago's animal kingdom. People probably don't picture scenes like this when they think of the animal kingdom, but you know, it's a tough world out there in the city. So yeah, as Seth sort of alluded to, we're pretty weird at the zoo. When I tell people that I work at a zoo and I study rats in alleys, they give me kind of a funny look like, why would you do this with your life? But while they might not be the most appealing or glamorous study species, if you're interested in preventing human-wildlife conflict, rats are really important and fascinating. And this is for a few reasons. Firstly, of wildlife, they're kind of one of the species that gets closest to us in terms of proximities, because rats can come into our homes and our businesses, and they also live in cities all over the world. Brown rats, otherwise known as Norway rats, are considered the second most successful mammal on the planet, just behind humans. And basically everywhere that people spread around the world, rats followed, and they do extremely well around us because we give them food and shelter in cities. However, when people and rats live together in cities, rats cause enormous damages. They can cause billions and billions of dollars in damages to property, as well as crops and food stores, and they have a number of public health risks. And there are a few reasons why rats are so successful in cities, and it really boils down to their ecology and understanding how they function as wildlife. So firstly, I want to point out that rats are extreme generalists. And what that means is basically they have a really broad diet, and they have a really broad range of habitats that they can live in. Rats can eat virtually anything, including garbage. So in cities, there are literally piles of food for rats where there are so many people and so much garbage. Rats also reproduce extremely quickly. They develop really quickly, and they have really large litters. So if you had a starting population of only 2 rats and you just sort of let them did their thing and gave them as much food as they want, those 2 rats will turn into over 1,200 rats in the span of a year. So sort of keeping up with all of those rats constantly being produced is really difficult if you're trying to manage rats. It's also really difficult to keep rats out of buildings and away from garbage because they can fit in surprisingly small spaces. Adult urban rats can get surprisingly large. You may have seen photos of enormous rats on the internet, like I have. And they can become like a pound or 2, which is really quite large for a rodent. However, the average adult rat can actually fit in the space of around the size of a quarter. So keeping them out of buildings is quite difficult for that reason, but also because rats have extremely strong teeth. Rats can actually chew holes through cement, through bricks, and even through metal pipes. And so excluding rats from buildings is challenging for a number of reasons. But sharing buildings with rats can be a real issue because of public health risks, as I mentioned. And one way that we can transmit diseases between rats and people is simply through sharing space from environmental contamination with rat feces and urine. And that is what I focus on because that's really kind of the most common way we are going to interact with rats, is just by seeing evidence of rats in your home, like droppings. So one example of a disease that people can get from rats just through urine is leptospirosis. And it's transmitted through rat urine, mainly through water. And millions of people around the world contract leptospirosis annually. It's a disease that can cause fever, muscle pain, neural issues, even hospitalization and death. But it is mostly in tropical regions where rats and flooding are really abundant. It's pretty rare in North America. However, just a couple of years ago, there was a really rat-infested apartment building in the Bronx where several people were hospitalized and one person even died from leptospirosis. And here in Chicago, dogs can get leptospirosis, and rates of leptospirosis in dogs has been increasing for about 20 years now. So it is worth knowing that these risks are out there in the urban environment. Rats can also carry a few types of bacteria that can be spread through food. Sort of famous examples of bacteria that can cause food poisoning, like Salmonella and E. coli. And so it's very important to keep rats away from food stores to protect the health of people that are going to eat that food. Now, here in Chicago, rats are kind of a big deal. You may have seen news articles about Chicago being the rattiest city in America. And I can't really say one way or another whether Chicago actually has more rats than any other city. But I do know that rat complaints have been increasing over the past decade. And the city spends millions of dollars trying to control rat populations in Chicago communities. And so understanding what are the drivers of rat problems in Chicago and sort of which communities are dealing with rats the most is a big issue in our city. Another big issue that could potentially impact rats is how much disparities there are in different Chicago neighborhoods, both in terms of incomes, also in terms of public health. So this map is from University of Illinois at Chicago, just showing the large disparity in incomes between the south and west sides of Chicago compared to the northeast side. And so just as there are these disparities in income, we might also expect that different communities are going to face different challenges with living with rats. And it's pretty well known that in terms of dealing with rat populations in cities, we have to tackle sanitation because rats really benefit from eating garbage. We want to be able to exclude them from buildings. And we also, of course, want to remove them when rats are too abundant. But to do that successfully, we really need more information about rat ecology. For example, where do rats even live in the city? We don't even really know that well. What sort of environmental features promote rat infestations? And what features promote public health risks in rats? We don't know a ton about why rats might carry diseases in some places and not others. At the same time, we want to know more about people's interactions with rats because that can carry risks for people's health outcomes, but also because a lot of rat management is driven by public complaints. But we don't know a ton about why people complain about rats or maybe not complain, and then you get sort of incomplete data that way. So we started the Chicago Rat Project back in 2018 to basically just learn more about the rats that live in Chicago to prevent health risks for Chicago communities and improve rat management. When we started the project, we partnered with Landmark Pest Management, and that enabled us to sample rats throughout the city of Chicago. So we really focused on 12 community areas where Landmark was trapping rats, and we selected these neighborhoods to range from very low incomes to very high incomes. So we could get that sort of full snapshot of what people were experiencing across the city. The first kind of question we tackled was simply, which Chicago neighborhoods had the most rats, and whether that was actually correlated with the number of rat complaints that people were making to the city, because the city prioritizes where they should allocate rodent control based on rat complaints. So Landmark went out and trapped rats in these neighborhoods, and we could compare, how quickly they caught the most rats in these different areas. And we found a nice relationship, actually, that the neighborhoods with the most rat complaints were actually the same places where Landmark caught the most rats. So this was really heartening because, again, it supported the city's approach to prioritizing rodent control where complaints were more common. When Landmark was going out to trap rats, we went out with them and did habitat surveys looking at features that might promote rats in these locations. For example, food sources for rats like garbage or pet waste, clutter that might provide shelter to rats, and access points into buildings like under doors or in walls. And we found that of all of the factors we looked at, garbage was by far the most important predictor of which alleys had more rats than others. And you might be sitting there thinking like, wow, that's rocket science. Rats like garbage. Wow, that's crazy. And I realized that this might be an obvious result to a lot of people, but it's really nice to be able to collect evidence that supports what management recommendations might be the most successful. If you need to, address one thing to prevent rat infestations, garbage, according to our work, is the #1 thing to prioritize. So the second part of the project was taking these rats that we had collected to look at which neighborhoods had the most rats and test these for diseases. And we were really interested in environmental features like sanitation that might promote disease in rats. So at these locations where the rats were trapped in the alleys, we recorded standing water complaints because, as I mentioned, leptospirosis is spread through rat urine in standing water. So we were curious whether rats would be more likely to have leptospirosis in places where there are more water issues. And we also recorded food inspections from restaurants, specifically restaurants with rodent violations, because we know that some bacteria carried by rats, like Salmonella and E. coli, can be transmitted through food. So restaurants are really important in that cycle of getting out to the public. Now, when we looked at rates of disease in these rats, we found that about 20% of rats had E. coli and around 5% had the bacteria that causes leptospirosis. But the rates with the rats were really different depending on which neighborhood you looked at. So some neighborhoods, like North Lawndale, for instance, had a sizable number of rats that were positive for both of these bacteria, versus others like West Ridge didn't have much of either. But when we zoomed in on those specific environmental features, we found that rats were more likely to have the bacteria that causes leptospirosis if they were caught in areas with more standing water issues. So that sort of supported our idea that, well, the water might be promoting transmission here. But this was especially true in high-income neighborhoods. And I don't have a great answer for why, rich people would have more leptopositive rats, but it might just support this idea that if you only looked at low-income neighborhoods where you suspected there were a lot of rat issues, you're not really getting the full picture, that diseases in rats are really everyone's issue. They're not only in low-income neighborhoods. And we found for E. coli that rats were more likely to have E. coli if they were trapped on blocks with more restaurants, but this was especially true in low-income neighborhoods. So there was kind of this opposite relationship with income for these two bacteria. And again, we can't really establish clearly why there would be this relationship, but it could be that in lower income neighborhoods, there are simply less resources available to manage food waste as well as rodent control. So these might be areas that would be good to prioritize to minimize disease transmission to the public. So for these parts of the project, we were really focusing on rats themselves. Just what were rats doing in Chicago? How were they living their lives? But people are a really important part of this equation because it's people that provide the food and the shelter that enable rats to do so well in cities. So now we really want to include people as part of the project because we know that rats affect people by infesting our homes and our businesses. This can affect our health, both physical and mental health. And it can also affect our attitudes about rats and other wildlife and also our behaviors. For example, if people engage in pest management. And at the same time, we know that people affect rats because we are constantly trying to kill them basically every day. So we put out traps, we put out poison to try to kill rats in neighborhoods. And these, of course, might affect, the number of rats that are out there, but they might also affect rat health and whether they're carrying diseases or not. And by poisoning rats, we may also be introducing poison for other wildlife as well. For example, it's pretty well documented that predators that eat rats are also exposed to the rat poison in those rats. So we want to understand how rodent control affects rats, but also urban ecosystems. And so this new phase of the project is really exciting because we're working with a really big team in a lot of different institutions around Chicago, including the Field Museum, Chicago State University, as well as DePaul University. And we're also working with experts at the University of British Columbia and Johns Hopkins. So for the first part of this project, we are going to distribute surveys to understand people's experiences with rats, their health outcomes as a result of living with rats. And we're also recruiting community scientists to trap rats on their own property so we can get a handle on which neighborhoods have the most rats and whether people's experiences with rats, differ based on the number of rats that they live with. We're also looking at how people affect rats by comparing whether trapping rats or simply just removing garbage is better for managing rats. Sort of the status quo is going out and killing as many rats as possible. Well, we want to see if just removing all of the garbage, would that do just as good of a job? We also want to look at the link between poisoning rats and their rates of disease, as well as looking at how often Chicago wildlife are exposed to rat poison. So this was our big plan for 2020. We were really going to get out there. We were going to understand everything. But as you may know, 2020 was a pretty weird year for a variety of reasons. And it was also a weird year for rats. So back in the spring, when there were a number of really intense restrictions in a lot of countries, people actually started reporting more rat sightings than usual. And this was in a lot of major cities like New Orleans, New York, London, Tokyo. And it was thought that when restaurants were closed down for the pandemic, all of a sudden you just kind of cut off this food source for rats. A lot of rats were relying on these dumpsters at restaurants. And when that garbage dried up, maybe they moved into residential areas to find new sources of food. So we sort of pivoted a little bit. Oh, sorry, before I get there. This issue got so intense that the CDC actually released a statement that communities might need to increase their rodent control as a result of these restaurant closures so that we don't have additional public health risks from rats on top of the existing pandemic. Okay, so with that out of the way, we wanted to understand here in Chicago whether people were actually seeing more rats during the stay-at-home order and to get a handle on what these impacts of living with rats would be on people who were stuck inside during the stay-at-home order. So we distributed an online survey through aldermanic offices and through community organizations in all 77 community areas in the city. And we got over 800 surveys back, which we were really excited about. This map shows the locations where people were reported responding to the survey from. You can see that a lot of our responses were from the north side of the city, but most neighborhoods were represented by at least one person. So in terms of how frequently people saw rats, 40% of people saw rats at least weekly in or around their home, and around 50% saw rats at least weekly on their block. Now, of course, people who are participating in a rat survey are probably more likely to see rats than other people, but this gives us a good baseline to just understand how often do people interact with rats, and is this changing over time? In terms of changes in rat sightings, around 20% of people saw more rats than usual during the stay-at-home order in or around their home. And a little bit more people, 23% of people, saw more rats on their block than they typically were. So we wanted to understand which residents were actually seeing more rats. And because people thought this was related to restaurant closures, we measured the number of restaurants surrounding where the respondents' closest major intersection was. And this graph is just showing the relationship between the number of restaurants around that survey respondent and the likelihood that they saw more rats during the stay-at-home order. So here on this x-axis, it ranges from 0 restaurants all the way up to like over 250 restaurants around their closest intersection. And this red line is just showing this increase, that people that live near more restaurants were more likely to say that they saw an increase in rats. So this sort of supports this idea that restaurant closures maybe have something to do with rats during the pandemic. We also found that people that lived in small apartment buildings were more likely to see this increase as well. And we don't have a great handle on like why housing type might make an effect, but it could be related to, you know, when you're in an apartment building, even if you're being as clean as possible, you have all these neighbors that you're sharing walls with. So people in small apartment buildings may have sort of a rat problem throughout the building that might have gotten worse. We also found that seeing more rats during the stay-at-home order was associated with seeing more rats in 2020, which kind of supports that 2020 is just a weird year for rats. And even though we would expect more rats in the spring, it wasn't just because of the spring. Something was happening in 2020. In terms of public health risks, just a couple things I want to point out here. I was really surprised that just in this 1 month that we were asking people about, this was in May 2020, over 30% of people saw rat feces in their home. So that's not great in terms of exposure to bacteria. And 4 people were bitten by rats in that 1 month period. So we really want to learn more about the contacts that people are having with rats that might affect their health. Okay, so one part of the survey that was much more intense than I thought it was going to be was when we asked people just to put in their own words how rat infestations made them feel. And people really engaged with this question. Cumulatively, the survey respondents collectively wrote a 10,000 word paper about how rats make them feel. So people had a lot to say on this subject. And here's just a word cloud of the most common words people were using to describe how rats made them feel. A lot of people felt really frustrated that rats are so difficult to eradicate. They felt frustrated that their neighbors were attracting rats, even though they were trying to be as clean as possible. They felt scared that rats were going to enter their homes. They were worried for their family and pets' health. A lot of people brought up things like feeling disgusting or gross or unclean. So there seems to be a lot of sort of sanitary and sort of shame issues about having rat infestations. And one thing that really jumped out to us, specific to the pandemic, were people saying that they felt scared, uncomfortable, or worried about using their patios or their yard, because when they went out there, they would either see rats or see evidence of rats, like rat droppings. So when people were stuck at home, having this rat problem sort of even restricted people even more. They didn't even feel comfortable just getting a little bit of fresh air outside their homes. So this is something that we are following up on now. Okay, so in terms of management implications, of course, we want to prevent rats before it becomes this huge issue. So it's important to be proactive when dealing with rats rather than waiting for a giant infestation and then trying to kill them all, because that is virtually impossible. So based on our work, the biggest thing we would recommend people to do is to stash your trash. Make sure that your garbage is in a receptacle without holes. Make sure that rats can't access your garbage. And also work with your neighbors. I was surprised at how many people brought up in our survey that rats were really this community issue, that like working by yourself, you're never going to solve this. You really need to work with your neighbors and with your community. And to that point, please call 311 to report your rat complaints, because that's how the city knows where there are rat issues, and it's a way to get free rodent control for your block. So those are some recommendations I would have for people struggling with rats. I just want to wrap up my little rat part of the talk by bringing it back to this concept of One Health. Then this really drives my whole research program at the zoo. And it's really just the idea that human health doesn't exist in isolation from wildlife health and environmental health. These things are all connected, as we are learning with our current pandemic, that if we have diseased wildlife living near us, that increases our public health risks as well. So at the zoo, we do a number of research projects, and especially this rat project, to understand how things like sanitation and pollution in cities might affect wildlife health for urban wildlife populations. And then in turn, that is going to affect public health. So it's important to understand the whole urban ecosystem to protect public health. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Seth.
All right, thanks, Maureen. Hopefully it can be thrown back over to my slides now, so you're all hopefully seeing a Chicago skyline. I wasn't quite sure how to finish up this talk. I decided to try to put Maureen's work in a bit of a context for you, because her project is one of a bunch of projects that we work on at the Urban Wildlife Institute, all trying to understand wildlife in cities, and especially Chicago. The way we really got this started ages ago is we decided to set up a long-term wildlife monitoring system across the metro area. So what you're seeing on this map, these little colored dots, those are field stations that we established over 10 years ago. There's over 100 of them, and they radiate out from downtown to cover all these different neighborhoods all across the suburbs and different communities, so that we can understand what different types of wildlife live in different parts of the city and why. This is kind of an unusual way to do this, because we weren't trying to study one animal, we were trying to gather data on the entire ecosystem. And to do that, at all these different field stations, we use a bunch of different technology. We use camera traps to study mammals. Actually, as I'm showing you on the right here, the camera traps help us study insects sometimes too, like this walking stick insect. We use audio monitors to help us collect data on birds and bats. We're trying to collect data on as many different species as we possibly can across the entire metro area, obviously including rats, as Maureen just talked about. So this approach has been pretty successful from a science standpoint. We've been able to publish a lot of super nerdy science papers. We learned things about opossums in cities, and we learned things about different neighborhoods that attract different types of species, specifically finding that wealthier neighborhoods have more coyotes and raccoons, which is kind of interesting. We looked at different types of land use, like parks and cemeteries and golf courses, to look at the different types of wildlife that live in all those different parts of our city. We even looked at predator-prey interactions, finding that, for example, deer and rabbits aren't able to avoid their predators like coyotes in the urban landscape the same way as they can in the wild by just moving far away from them. So we have to totally rethink how predator-prey interactions happen in the city. So I didn't want to go into a lot of detail in any one of these studies for you. This is just to indicate that this is a good system. It's a good working model. And what we came to realize slowly over time was that this was a model that could work beyond just Chicago. And that's important, because we want to understand urban wildlife across the world. We don't just want to know what's going on with Chicago's urban wildlife, but with urban wildlife anywhere. We want to understand what are the scientific truths that we can discover about species that apply no matter where you are. And the way we eventually decided to do this was by creating an alliance of researchers called the Urban Wildlife Information Network, or sometimes I say UWIN. And what UWIN is, put really simply, is just we found other researchers in other cities around currently the US and Canada who like this approach, who like the idea of studying urban animals in many different sites for a long time, and decided to do the same thing we're doing, but in their city. And then together we put all our data into a big barrel where we can understand urban wildlife, not just in one city, not just in one area, but anywhere they live. And this approach has been surprisingly successful. So we have been adding partners all across the US and Canada over the last several years. Actually, during COVID, we've added, I think, 5 new partners to this network. You can kind of see on this map that we have pretty good data now from a bunch of different cities all across the region, cities like LA, Dallas, other kinds of big American and Canadian cities. So this is cool for me because it widens the scope of the species I can study. Right now, I can actually do research on things like moose or bears that we don't have in Chicago, but other cities around North America do have to contend with these species. So it really greatly expands the scope of what we can accomplish in urban wildlife work. I don't want to go too far down this super nerdy rabbit hole, but I just wanted to give you a sense in this little figure that I built of how cool this is that we are now working between cities. So urban wildlife biology, as long as it has been a thing, which is probably 40 years or so, has been at the bottom part of this little graph I made up. We've been answering questions about animals within cities. And that could be a question like, do more coyotes live in cemeteries or parks in Toledo? Or what neighborhoods have the most rats in Chicago? And those are cool questions. But now that we have data from multiple cities, we can ask bigger questions. So let's imagine, just as a fun example, we wanted to compare wildlife in Chicago and Indianapolis. So Chicago and Indianapolis are really different cities. They're very different sizes. They have very different human populations and cultures. We eat hot dogs in a completely different manner, which could be an important data point. I don't know. But the important thing is Chicago and Indianapolis are pretty close together in space, really. So if you went back in time, or if you removed them magically somehow from the landscape, you should see pretty similar animals living in those two areas. But we actually see really big differences in the wildlife that live in Chicago and Indianapolis. What that tells us is that something about the way those two cities were built led to different wildlife outcomes. That's exciting because we could change that. We could build cities differently to attract some species that maybe we want, other species that maybe we don't. And this design lets us go even bigger than that. So I could also, if I wanted to, for fun, compare wildlife living in Seattle and Phoenix. We have data from both of those cities too. We're going to see completely different wildlife in those two areas, but it's mostly because they're in completely different ecosystems. Seattle's in a rainforest and Phoenix is in the desert. So the differences we see there have more to do with things like climate and land cover. But because we have data now coming in from across such a wide area, we can answer questions at all three scales. We can understand exactly why animals live where they live based on how the city was built, factors within that city, and big scale regional stuff like climate change, for example. We can use these data to do fun things. Like one of the questions that I'm always asked is like, well, okay, you have data from all these cities. Which cities have the most wildlife? So this is just mammals that we're looking at here, but we decided to rank all the cities we study and who has the most mammals that we've detected in our study. And currently the winner, a little suspiciously, I think, is Iowa City, Iowa. Not quite sure why they win, but I will say Chicago is top 5. So that's pretty good for a big, giant Midwestern city. But we could also flip this question, right? Okay, so maybe Iowa's the winning city. What's the winning species? If you look at all these mammals that we have across all these cities, which one is the most common in the most cities? And you probably won't be surprised to know it is the raccoon. It is always the raccoon. They're amazingly good at living in cities and using their weird little human-y thumbs to open up stuff. I will say the method we use for this study is camera traps, which don't capture rats, or I'm sure Maureen would point out the rats would be definitely the winner. But amongst the bigger mammals, it's raccoons. So we can use this data set from all these cities to settle debates. I don't know how many of you know how science works, but science basically works by arguing, right? So someone will write a paper and they go, oh, I did a study on this animal in my city, and here's how this animal works. Then someone else looks at the same animal in a different city at a different time, and they say, I didn't see what you saw. You're dumb. That's not right. They don't say dumb, but it's similar. And the debate wages back and forth, and there's never any resolution. But because we have data from so many cities, we can actually settle these big scientific debates, which is exciting. So just as one example, we decided recently to test a theory called the luxury effect. The luxury effect says you should see more animals in the richer parts of cities than in the poorer parts of cities. Well, we have data from all these cities. We were able to look at this. So what you're seeing in this graph is that when the purple curve is shifted to the right of the dotted line, that means we saw more mammals in the richer part of that city than we did in the poorer part of that city. And you can see that this effect is true for almost all of our cities. So we are able to say, yeah, the luxury effect does seem to be a thing that we can measure and quantify across many, many different urban areas. And we can do this over and over with all these different pet theories that people have about how urban wildlife work, where they live, and how we can better live with them. It's a very cool data set that we have access to through this giant network. We have over 2 million camera trap images, just as one example. No one has any kind of data set, anything like this, which enables us to have enormous power to understand these urban wildlife issues. For example, people keep asking questions about wildlife during COVID and how much are they changing their behavior? Some people are calling me saying, oh, the animals are taking over the cities. What's the reality? Well, we have the data where when this whole thing is over, we will be able to assess that because we'll be able to say, well, we were studying animals before COVID and after COVID in all these cities. Here's what really happened with them. And that's important to know because you may be seeing these news stories about animals during COVID, but I'll point out that a bunch of them are fake. A lot of these stories about animals doing new stuff during COVID are not true. For example, people said that dolphins were clogging up all the canals in Venice. That was not true. But we will have real data on this. And what's cool about that is when we can learn how the animals change their behavior and what they do when we stay inside, that teaches us things about, okay, how can we modify our behavior to maybe help out the species we want to help out? We are able to use these data directly to try to solve problems that exist across the city. We're actually right now working to co-author a new wildlife management and coexistence plan for the city of Chicago. We are also writing it as a template that we hope other cities will pick up and modify for their own use so that we can help create plans, blueprints for people to coexist with wildlife in cities around the world. Our partners across this network are doing really cool stuff. I just kind of wanted to highlight a few of the projects that they're doing. We have partners in California, and they work specifically to study large mammals near highway crossings. So for big animals like mountain lions and bears, a lot of them are killed on highways. And in California, this is an especially big problem. So these partners are using the data they collect as part of our network to try to figure out where to put highway overpasses to actually let animals safely cross roads, which is pretty exciting and cool. We spend a lot of time trying to really directly use our research to influence how the city of Chicago is built, and that means talking with architects, planners, aldermen, and congressmen, and all different sorts of folks to try to make sure that new projects like the Wild Mile and the Burnham Wildlife Corridor really are thinking about wildlife when they're being built, and we're thinking about building in a space for biodiversity and not just for humans. One of our partners that's doing this really well are our partners in Edmonton, Alberta. This is a partnership directly between scientists and the city of Edmonton, and they work to collect data as part of our network, but then it feeds straight into the city's green network strategy, where they're building parks and different green spaces so that the data are used directly to decide how the city is built. So wildlife are baked into the process of urbanizing Edmonton. They have a seat at the table. We want to replicate this process in many other cities, including Chicago. We actually, just last year, we had a summit at the zoo where we brought together scientists from all across North America to talk about these data. But more importantly, I think, we made them all invite urban designers, architects, developers, so that we could really talk about what does a blueprint for wildlife-friendly cities look like? How do we connect the scientists to the people who actually do the constructions? And how do we make sure that wildlife are considered as a part of that entire process? It was a very hands-on sort of thing, and we really are, from this summit, starting to build architectural guides, blueprints to wildlife-inclusive cities, buildings, neighborhoods. But the other cool thing about networking all these scientists together is that when somebody has a good idea, they can tell everyone else about it, and it can then be amplified across the network. So some of our partners are educators. They're building new educational programs to teach people about urban wildlife and the animals we live around. When one person builds that, they can then expand it out to other cities. And on the left side of this slide, you're seeing the same educational program being presented in Chicago on top, Iowa City in the middle, and Austin, Texas on the bottom. And projects, for example, like Maureen's rat project, that are very successful in one city, another city could pick up that model, could pick up that design, and could use it so that our impact of our work is just so much greater. As kind of an example of that, we have partners in St. Louis who have taken educational programming that we developed in Chicago to try to connect students to urban wildlife. This is a program called Partners in Fieldwork that's pretty cool. They took this program essentially and just picked it up and did it again in St. Louis. So the same students who are able to study wildlife around the bean can, well, not the same students, different students can use the same procedures to study wildlife around the arch, which I think is pretty cool. We're also really interested in making sure that our work is used to try to help people have more equitable experiences with wildlife. As Maureen pointed out a bit in her talk, everyone in a city is exposed to wildlife, but not everyone has the same experience of wildlife. And we know that people of color, we know that people of lower incomes tend to have more negative interactions with wildlife. And these systemic inequities lead to people having really different attitudes towards wildlife. And it's obviously part of the systemic racism that we know underpins much of our society. And one of our co-authors here, Dr. Chris Schell, has been publishing a lot of articles about this. And the maybe silver lining of our design is that we have data, and Maureen just showed you this, across many different neighborhoods, across many different parts of the US and of Canada. And we can actually directly study this. We can study the effects of inequity on wildlife and on people in those neighborhoods and on One Health in a way that we hope will enable us to point towards a future where people can have fairer, more equitable interactions and experiences with wildlife. So the network is really just getting started. We're continuing to blow this up around the world, we hope eventually. We're using all different kinds of technologies now, including these tiny little audio moth guys. You can't really tell from this picture, but these things are itty tiny, but they record data on birds, bats, frogs, anything that we can hear, which is really exciting. We're continuing to try to use the latest, greatest technology to really understand wildlife across all these cities. And we want to expand beyond the US and Canada. We want to create a truly global network that goes across Europe, Africa, South America, to really understand urban wildlife across the entire world. So those are kind of some of our big directions. Thank you so much for listening to my talk. I wanted to thank all of our different partners in this network. And I wanted to make sure that you know that if you want to get involved in Maureen's rat project, you can certainly do that. You can shoot her an email at maureenmurray@lpzoo.org. There are different ways to get involved in that project that she will be happy to tell you all about. So thank you so much. Just by being here, you're in a way helping support our work and the work of the zoo, which is more and more challenging during this era of COVID. And yeah, I know that I'm right at 45 minutes after, but I'm happy to stick around for a bit longer and take any questions that you might have.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Seth and Maureen, for sharing the work that you both do, both the specific work and the broader work that could be impacted by the Urban Wildlife Information Network, and for showcasing the life that lives in Chicago. So I know we have a lot of questions. We're definitely not going to be able to get through them all, so we'll try to pick and choose a few that will help us cover a few different topics during the Q&A session. So Maureen, I'll start with you. I know you talked a little bit about it, but can parasites be transmitted between animals and humans? And if so, how does that happen?
Yeah, that's a great question. Okay, so parasites are basically anything like a bacteria or a virus or maybe sometimes a tiny insect, something that lives off of a host that causes some sort of health product. So a disease is caused by a parasite. So when we're talking about parasites, we're talking about a lot of different things. And when they come from wildlife and infect humans, that's what's called a zoonotic disease. And there are a lot of examples of that. Like you've probably heard of rabies. That is a zoonotic disease. You've probably heard of Lyme disease. That's a zoonotic disease that comes from ticks. So the short answer is yes, there are a ton of examples. I talked about a couple of them in the rat talk, mainly in the context of bacteria. But for other wildlife like coyotes, they can get things like ticks and mites and fleas. And some of them can infect humans. Like, for instance, ticks can go between wildlife and humans. But other ones are more specific. Like, for example, coyotes and foxes can get a parasite called sarcoptic mange, which is caused by a mite called Sarcoptes scabiei. And we have our own version of that mite disease. It's called scabies. It causes like a rash, like skin thickening and itching and stuff. In wildlife, it causes like fur loss. But in that case, wild canids like coyotes and foxes, they have their own mite. People have their own mite. So that's a case where the parasite is actually a wildlife parasite that is not going to jump to people.
Thank you very much for that answer. And Seth, I'll direct the next question towards you. So someone wanted to know specifically about life on Isle Royale, but I'm going to ask just in general, how can scientists monitor wildlife without being too invasive?
Yeah, so I decided not to go into too much detail about the tech that we use, but I probably should have, because the tech we use is cool because it's non-invasive. So we use things like camera traps, so that takes a picture of an animal that walks by it, but it doesn't bother the animal other than that. And we use devices that listen. We use devices that listen for the sounds that birds make and for the sounds that bats make, which we can't even hear because they're above our range of hearing, but bats make these sounds when they're trying to catch their insect prey. So we're actually very dedicated to this idea that we can study animals without, in many cases, really doing the things that bother them, like having to catch them in a trap where then maybe they're stressed out. There are times when you need to do that, but we do that as little as possible. And we're really proud of that philosophical approach to our work.
Yeah, I think that's really important, right? Not changing the natural behaviors by not getting too involved in the natural environments, even in an urban ecosystem. I think that's really important to note and trying to make as little of an impact as possible.
Now that doesn't apply as well to the rats. The rats, we're a little more hands-on, but
I was staying conspicuously silent.
I noticed that, yeah.
That's a great way to
different animals, different approaches. Maureen, someone is asking whether it would be more beneficial to have or eliminate the coyote population within the city.
And coyotes are a very polarizing species of wildlife. Some people love them. Some people hate them. Some people think we should have more of them. Some people think we shouldn't have any of them at all. And I think it's important to think of sort of like what an ecosystem in a city, how it functions when you're thinking about wildlife. So coyotes are a great example of a larger predator that can persist in cities. And predators are really important for ecosystems to function, because if you only have prey species like rodents and rabbits and things like that, they're going to get really, really, really abundant and maybe overabundant without predators. So having animals like coyotes, or another good example are bobcats, having predators like them in cities can help keep rodent populations down. And that just makes the whole ecosystem function better. And selfishly, rodents carry a lot of diseases for people. So having predators control rodents is also good for our health. I think the flip side of that is that even if you wanted to eradicate coyotes, it's basically impossible. They're very adaptable. They actually can reproduce more when they're being persecuted. And they can eat virtually anything, live almost anywhere. So even if you try to sort of get rid of every last coyote, it's going to take unbelievable amounts of money, time, effort, and probably not even work. And in the process, you're going to ruin all of these awesome ecosystem services that coyotes are just giving us for free. So I guess if I had to come down on one side, I mean, I'm an ecologist, so I'm going to come down on team keep coyotes. I realize they cause conflicts, but there are better ways to handle it than eradicating them, like minimizing garbage around people's homes that might bring coyotes closer to people.
Yeah, I think you touched on a topic. I might just ask you to define it really quickly. The term ecosystem services.
Oh, yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, for
just
sure.
Expand on what that is really quickly?
Ecosystem services are things that are provided by the interactions between plants and animals, or between sort of the weather and the environment that benefit us. So some examples would be like predators. As I just talked about, predators consuming rodents that might carry diseases to us. Those predators are performing an ecosystem service by sort of keeping those prey populations down. Another really good ecosystem service is just the simple fact that urban trees provide a lot of shade, and that cools down the environment around the tree. So in cities, heat is actually a pretty big issue. There are pockets of cities that have a lot of pavement and buildings. They can get really hot. But just by having things like street trees, those ecosystem services can benefit people. I'll just give one more example. Another great ecosystem service is having wetlands in the environment can prevent flooding, because now you have sort of a patch of the environment that can absorb a lot of water that gets dumped all at once. So yeah, the short answer is just things that happen in the environment that benefit us. So those are some examples that happen in cities.
Awesome, thank you. That's really helpful. Seth, I'm going to throw this next question to you and maybe expand on it a little bit. So someone wants to know, which animal in Chicago do you think is most likely to go extinct within the next few years due to the habitat and carrying capacity, and what types of animals do less well in cities?
Yeah, that's a great big question. So I'm assuming they mean animals that are going to go extinct within Chicago, though they will still exist in other places. And there, I think the example that we are seeing from our data is probably the gray fox. We know that traditionally the gray fox was pretty common in the area, but we almost never see them on our camera traps anymore, to the point where I think they may be going locally extinct. And that's really too bad, because the gray fox, if any of you are familiar with it, sort of like the red fox that you probably are more familiar with, but they're smaller, they're almost cat-sized, and they're the only canid, which is a dog species related to dogs and wolves, that can climb trees. So that's kind of a cool superpower. They're also adorable, but so they're not doing well. You know, Maureen touched on when she was talking about rats, one of the key things we know that makes a species successful in the city is that typically they're generalists. They're species that can eat many, many different things, and they can change their behavior quickly, because urban landscapes change very quickly. We as humans are always modifying things. We're building new stuff. We're changing things around. And so animals that can very quickly change what they're doing and adapt in that way do well. Whereas animals that are more specialists, what we think of animals that kind of do one thing and do it very well, when we mess with that, their ability to do that one thing, well, then they struggle. They don't really have a backup plan. Also, we know that really large-bodied animals, things that are huge, that just need a ton of space, they don't do well in cities. So that's why, you know, we don't really see things like wolves and bears really excelling at city life. They're just too big. They need too much open space, and we don't really have it so much in cities. So that's sort of a very general answer to your question.
Yeah, I think that's a perfect answer. Thank you for sharing. So we're kind of winding down out of time. I just wanted to take 1 minute to ask you both this last question. And how did you get interested in the work that you're currently doing? If you just want to share briefly, that'd be awesome.
You want to go first, Maureen?
Sure, yeah. So when I was I guess it goes all the way back. Yeah, typical story. When I was a kid, I was obsessed with animals, but I was specifically obsessed with tigers, and I wanted to go in the jungle and study tigers. But then as I got older, I learned about birds and then got pretty obsessed with birds and animal behavior and things like animal learning and bird song and all that kind of stuff. And it wasn't until I was looking for a project in graduate school that I saw an ad about urban coyotes that just sort of fascinated me, because I already was learning a lot about how animals learn to adapt to their environments when, like as Seth mentioned, in rapidly changing environments. And it's just such a perfect example that coyotes really thrive in a lot of different places because they're able to change their behavior. So that really got me excited about urban coyotes. And then that was sort of the gateway drug to lots of other urban critters and now rats, which are just tiny coyotes. So that's how I got into it.
Yeah, I got started. Actually, I got mad is what happened. I was in college and I had to do a project for an animal behavior class, and I decided to do it on these urban prairie dogs. I was living in Boulder, Colorado, and I lived right next door to these urban prairie dogs. And I thought the project would be really easy because I could just watch them like from my house and write up this paper. So I did that and it was fine. But the problem was I went to the library because we had to cite a bunch of science papers about whatever we were going to study. So I went to the library to get a bunch of data on these urban prairie dogs. And what I found out was that no one had studied them. No one knew anything. They didn't know the first thing about urban prairie dogs. And when I asked a bunch of scientists why that was, they kind of like scoffed at me and they were like, well, why would anyone study an animal in a city? That's dumb. And I was young and stupid, but I was like, well, because that's where we live, and because cities are getting bigger, and because this is an issue that's going to get more and more important. And none of them would even listen to me. And I sort of got mad about it. I was like, well, someone has to study urban animals. You can't just live on an urban planet where no one knows anything about the animals that live in those cities. So I decided out of petulant irritation, I would just make that my whole career. And here I am.
I think clearly the irritation has worked out for you.
Yeah, it's going okay so far.
Both stories have led to some really great work. Thank you both for sharing that more personal side to the science, which is important too. And we want to thank you both for joining us and speaking on behalf of the work that you do and on behalf of the Lincoln Park Zoo and the Chicago Rat Project. We're really grateful for your time and expertise, and thank you for answering those questions. We'd like to thank everyone else for tuning into today's program. If you'd like to evaluate it, please go to c2st.cnf.io. We'd really appreciate your feedback. That helps us to continue to put together really relevant, exciting topics to our viewers and lets us put out more programs like this. If you want to rewatch anything, or if you missed part of today's program, you're welcome to go to our YouTube channel, C2ST TV, or our Facebook channel, and you're going to be able to view all of our videos there. If you enjoyed today's program, please consider donating to C2ST at c2st.org, where you can also find archives of our previous programs and our timely STEM blogs. Thank you all for watching. We appreciate it.